Hi, this is Paul. So, as you may or may not know, I just had a conversation with Justin Brierley, and it's coming out on the channel. I'm not sure when I'll drop this video, depends on how long I talk. Um, and I noticed that I just had the conversation with Justin Brierley yesterday, and then this morning I opened up YouTube, and Skye Jethani's talking to Justin Brierley. Now, Justin, again, has left Premier Christian Radio. He's out on his own. He's doing podcasts. He's working. He's just written a book. He's working on a new podcast that's devoted to the book, and so we had a conversation about it. Now, for those of us in this little corner, a lot in this book is not new because most of you have lived sort of the whole new atheism ride, and then you're sort of back to being faith questioning. You've gone down the Jordan Peterson rabbit hole. You know who Tom Holland is, and you've probably listened to plenty of him. You know who Douglas Murray is. So when this book is now available, and you can order it. There'll be a link. There'll be a link below for how to order it through Justin's website in the UK and in the US. But I was really curious about where Skye Jethani was going to go, because for a number of years before Jordan Peterson, I watched the Holy Post, I watched the Phil Visser podcast, the various iterations of it through. I was a regular commenter on Facebook, and so I've watched these guys for a long time, and I know some in the community, like Hank Cruz, has no love lost. These guys are from sort of the deepest part of evangelicalism near Wheaton College, Carroll Stream, Illinois. Christianity Today. Skye Jethani was a Christianity Today editor for a while. He's been independent, speaker, books, all that kind of thing. And they, for the most part, they've sort of been moderate to progressive evangelical. Let's say progressive evangelical, if we're going to have sort of boundary markers. Progressive evangelical tends to be, say, affirming of same-sex marriage. At this point, Skye Jethani and Phil Visser, to the best of my knowledge, are not affirming, but they're exactly the kind of people that Bethel, McGrew, and Doug Wilson, and Rod Dreher. These are exactly the kinds of squishy evangelicals that a lot of people have no patience for. And part of what we're dealing with is this whole guilt by association. And actually, I thought nobody put it better than the carefree wanderer Hans Georg Mueller. Cale's actually been telling me I really have to read his book, and so on pro-felicity, and I'm really excited to. I'm just reading a lot of books right now, partly because I can. But what he said. Now this of course was the video that he took down about Oliver Anthony, and I really want to find a pithy name for this spirit that he's describing here, because we're all seeing it a lot.
Rather than seriously engaging with the actual working class problem addressed in the song, overtime hours for bullshit pay, it is primarily observed in the mode of second-order observation. Less than observing the song itself, the media focus on observing how it is observed. In short, the public is warned not to like the song to avoid being labeled as right-wing by the general peer. The main purpose of the Guardian article is to tarnish the profile of the song and, by extension, of its listeners. If the right wing loves it, then you become right wing if you love it too. What is more, the song dares to bring up the image of fat, jobless Americans buying junk food with their welfare money. This image is not just highly realistic, but also a critique of an unjust capitalist economy where the wages of workers are so low that they are little different from welfare. The song depicts a capitalist system producing a choice of lifestyle for large parts of the population. Either you work endless hours for bullshit pay that leaves you with not much of a life to live, or you collect welfare and become part of a debilitated underclass who destroy themselves physically and mentally with the cheapest forms of consumption.
I really wish he had left this video up because I'd love to hear more of what he has to say. So my sense of just kind of peeking in on the Holy Post podcast over the last few years has been sort of this evangelical, sort of this middle class, politically moderate, evangelical gatekeeping that, lately, I mean, it's all these podcasts about Christian nationalism, dread Christian nationalism. And this is the problem. And, Phil is complaining about this and Skye's complaining about it. I know exactly who this is pitched to. It's people who still have small o orthodox evangelical beliefs in the Apostles' Creed. They for the most part have a broadly evangelical worldview, but politically they're moderate, they're well educated, they're successful. They don't want to be mean to all of the people that you're not supposed to be mean to, but they are very suspicious about all of the people that you're supposed to be very suspicious about, according to a certain set of norms. Sort of like this second. I don't have the word for it. I don't have that spirit named yet. Once we get the name of that spirit, it will be much better for us to sort of keep that spirit under control. So I was super interested in how this interview would go, because this interview has in it, of course, well, most of you haven't had a chance to get Justin's book yet, but Jordan Peterson figures heavily into Justin's thesis about this new wave of Christianity, as does Tom Holland. Tom Holland's not quite sketch with these people yet. They don't really know him that well, but Louise Perry, all of the people. I'm sure Mary Harrington. I don't know what on earth they would do with Mary Harrington. I really don't. So they're over there in suburban Chicago, and they're sort of. This is sort of the. This particular subculture, I think, sort of reached its peak in Willow Creek, and they're very much. Basically, by the way that they are responding to Justin's book, I wonder what their path sort of into the future might look like. I don't know. So I'm just going to skip ahead to now the little YouTube chapter says surprising allies, and I thought, oh, that's a nice way to say it. But let's listen to it.
So let's talk about what's happened since then. New atheism was largely led by academics. I mean, you talk about the four horsemen, three of.
So the previous chapter, they went into basically the fall of new atheism elevator gate.
Whom I think were academics, and one journalist. In recent years, it feels like a lot of these free-thinking academics that had been part of new atheism have come to recognize a new threat. They're not necessarily seeing the real danger coming from traditional religious belief.
And the real danger isn't coming from William Lane Craig. The real danger isn't coming from the kind of straight up apologetics that were sort of the automatic counterpart, sort of what Unbelievable was doing 15 years ago. That's not where the threat is coming from.
Shifted to recognize a new danger on the horizon. Describe that danger and why it has gotten their attention.
And I'm going to invoke someone who wasn't one of the four horsemen, but who you, I believe, had on the Holy Post in your early days, Skye, Peter Boghossian, who is a well-known sort of academic. He sort of was, up until 2021, professor of philosophy at Portland State University. And he's just such an interesting example of the way that this has changed. I first encountered Peter Boghossian back in, I think, around 2014, when he released his sort of what I think he hoped would be a bestseller in the vein of the God Delusion. It was called A Manual for Creating Atheists, and it was almost exactly what it says on the tin. It was this sort of guide for how to basically talk someone out of their delusional religious belief.
I have to interrupt a second. It was what it was said on the tin. You Brits, you develop the language. It's so beautiful. I mean, that's just such a vivid image. I'm sure it's just a saying that you have, but I actually bought, when during the whole hoax thing, and when I had my conversation with James Lindsay, I had a couple of phone calls with Peter Boghossian, and yeah, I mean, what Justin's bringing up is key.
Beliefs. And when I had him on my show in conversation, go ahead.
If I can interrupt you for a second, because we did have him on our show. We talked about his book, and then Phil somehow got connected with him through social media. They struck up a relationship. Peter Boghossian invited Phil to come out and speak in his class about why he's a Christian. Phil stayed at his home and developed a real friendship. And then he came on our show to talk about that whole dynamic. And it was I should have researched what episode that was in the early years of the Holy Post, but it was a fascinating journey for both of them. And really amazing.
I think I remember seeing that.
So sorry to interrupt, but yeah, that's the history of Boghossian.
But the much more interesting question for me is, what do you think of Boghossian now? Because, well, he's certainly not a Christian, but he's basically an anti-woke culture war. He's just swung from one end of the culture war all the way around to the other.
Yeah, and in my interactions with Boghossian, I found him to be a very personable person. But what I noticed was that his tone changed dramatically.
Yeah, Peter. If you get a chance to talk to Peter, he's a very sweet guy. He's a fun guy. Reminds me of a lot of East Coast people, even though he lives on the West Coast, sort of like me.
Particularly, and maybe it was in the process of changing when you had your interaction with him. But because he had, taken this very strong line, when he wrote this book, that essentially religious belief should be categorized as a mental delusion, literally. But when I approached him only 4 or 5 years later, I think it was 2018, I was coming to Portland. I was putting on a sort of an onstage event, was looking for an atheist to have a conversation. And I emailed him about it. His reply stunned me because...
So if you roll out to Home Depot for day laborers, where do you roll into town looking for atheists? I was just looking for a local atheist that I could put on stage.
He came back saying, Justin, I'm going to politely decline your invitation because I'm really not, talking or debating God any longer. And the reason for this will become apparent. But he said, essentially, I think of Christians now more as allies very often than as enemies. I've completely changed my thinking really around the value of faith. And he said, I think there's a much more sort of worrying enemy on the horizon, and you'll find out more about that. So I was intrigued, and lo and behold, a few months later, it turned out that he, along with some fellow co-conspirators, were behind a sort of hoax set of papers that were submitted to peer-reviewed journals, but they were effectively parodying and sending up what they termed grievance studies. So these were studies that...
And that, of course, is well known.
That were kind of written in the language of politically correct sexuality, but because they were written, the demon was actually from within the academy, not from sort of fundamentalist Christians. And so that was just a huge, interesting turn, a pivot really, where, someone like Boghossian simply stopped attacking Christians and people of faith and started basically going for his own secular peers who he thought were going in a radically wrong direction. And that for me was one instance, and I've seen that happen in so many cases now.
There's just a lot of them. They've sort of turned in on each other. Now, remember, Skye's question was about the academy. It's just, this is all happening in the academy. And, for many academics, they live to fight these kinds of battles. That's sort of that's sort of where a lot of academics find their meaning.
Where the landscape has changed in that way.
So you mentioned Boghossian saying to you that he viewed Christians as allies more than enemies in the past. And a number of the folks that you highlight in the book, these academics who maybe had been atheist or more secularist, now identify as almost Christian curious. I don't know if you use that term in the book, but they feel Christian curious. But is it a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, that they've come to see Christians as allies against a sort of progressive fundamentalism that's taken over the academy? Or is there something more going on? Is there an actual genuine interest in the claims of Christian faith itself? Or is it just, hey, we all have this bigger enemy and I'm going to stop attacking Christians and just welcome them to the fight?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixture, and I think in the case of some, it is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There are people who, are feeling like at least the Christians, even though I, don't agree with the word they say, they provide some kind of bulwark with me against what they see as this threat and so on, and so I think you probably have got a lot of the kind of to use the word anti-woke sort of protesters and people who feel like they've got common cause in that sense. But I think you also do have, that phrase is quite a good one, Christian curious academics and thinkers who are essentially understanding and realizing that the new atheists really did throw the baby out with the bathwater, that by rejecting religion altogether, they failed to see the value that was actually there in the Christian story, the Christian worldview, the heritage that the Christian sort of worldview has given the West. And I'm seeing many of those as well taking a real interest in the Christian story, asking themselves, can we live without something like God? Can we live without something that gives us that kind of sense of meaning and purpose and identity? Because I think a lot of them are understanding that there's what's often being termed a meaning crisis in the West, that as society continues to fracture and become more and more
You should have mentioned Don Vervaeke.
polarized and divisive, that there's,
although I doubt Skye knows who John Vervaeke is,
very little alternative that's ever worked, and that perhaps will work than the Christian story.
Yeah, that's a significant part of the book that I found really fascinating. You at one point quoted new atheist Douglas Murray, and he said this: "I'm now in the self-confessedly conflicted and complex situation of being, among other things, an uncomfortable agnostic who recognizes the values and the virtues that the Christian faith has brought." And Jordan Peterson is featured very heavily in the book, and his fascinating journey, both towards celebrity status as well as his maybe Christian curious posture. But a number of these folks, including Peterson, clearly values religion and maybe even specifically Christian faith, but it's often valued for pragmatic reasons. They've come to recognize its benefit to society, the heritage that we've been given from its impact.
And this is a critique of Peterson across the sort of evangelical culture war spectrum
Throughout, especially Western history. And they've also acknowledged, many of them, the risk of abandoning that entirely. That when you just erase religion and erase the Christian values and virtues that have saturated our society, it's not necessarily better. My question is, does that lead to another danger? Because I've heard very similar arguments from Christian nationalists here in the United States, and their argument,
dread Christian nationalists. This is what we're. I don't know how they got that time machine and put that chapel right in the middle of Duke and Wellesley and all those places. How did they go back and put all those Ten Commandment monuments around the country? How did they sneak back in time and get all that stuff in books?
and is very rarely about the virtues of Christ himself or the virtues of sincere communion with Christ. They're advocating often the cultural, political, social value of Christendom, of keeping this Western tradition of Christian culture alive, apart from any true adherence to the gospel or communion with Christ. Is that one of the things that could develop here from this new Christian?
Now again, so here's the question of Christendom. And again, with the recession of modernity, which with it, secularism, let's say Christian secular humanism, that sort of reached its peak at the middle of the 20th century. You can find a peak document in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. As Christian secularism sort of creeps back, what are Christians going? I mean, this is sort of the question of the moment is, okay, how do Christians? It was easier for Christians to live in America when the secularism was sort of Christian secularism. And I'm going to play this clip again just because I'm going to play the heck out of this clip. I'm going to play this clip so often on YouTube that that it's going to start to wear out. And I'm going to play this clip because this is a voice that the Holy Post can respect. My apologies to you regular viewers, because you can fast forward 8 minutes if you don't want to watch this yet again.
This is hard. So let me give you the best answer I can. Liberal democracy, which is how I'm using the word liberal very broadly. Liberal democracy, which is how our Constitution was written, how our country was founded, was the idea that the government is neutral when it comes to religion and religious beliefs. It does not impose religion and religious beliefs on people. It doesn't impose a worldview on people. It doesn't.
Now, again, you have to use the secular definition of religion when you do that, not really the reformed definition of religion that I was taught even in junior high at Eastern Christian Junior High, that all of life is religion, worldview. Of course, Tim Keller knows all this, but he's saying religion in sort of the secular way that religion is compartmentalized.
And say it doesn't hook up to Catholicism or Lutheranism or whatever, and therefore it's big on freedom of association, freedom of speech. It's a pluralistic society, so you have Jews and Catholics and various kinds of Protestants and atheists, and it doesn't impose a worldview or religious views on people, and or moral values on people. And it came out of the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was born a couple hundred years before America, in the wars of religion, when everybody was fighting. Basically, people were dying as to which religion my country is going to be. And a lot of the thinkers of Europe came up and said, hey, you know what? Let's create a society in which there's no one religion that is the official religion, and we are coming together just as reasonable people, and we decide how we want to live together. And we park our religion at the door when we come into the public realm, and we make laws based on common good and that kind of thing.
That's sort of the secular dance. Now, again, this is the dance that someone like Doug Wilson is complaining about, using the most extraordinary language. And no, this is a cultural Christianity dance that afforded the kinds of pluralism within Christianity, and even to a degree outside of Christianity, as long as the other religions and, of course, many of the Jewish groups were well acclimated to this, because they also came out of Europe. Islam struggled with it, but a lot of Islamic immigrants have sort of gotten with it, because, of course, it was in Turkey with Ataturk, and it almost killed Islam. But this is sort of Christian secularism that said, okay, here's the program, here are the expectations, and it's basically liberalism, which of course grew out of Christianity in the West and was popularized all around the world, at least up until not very many years ago. Most of the world sort of followed along in this great sort of implicit American empire that we had.
And for a very long time, that worked in America. And I just want you to know that that's the problem. The big problem is that liberal democracy is in crisis. And the reason it's in crisis is because, and here's the irony, and I don't think I think I could trace this out if I was writing something down. I think it would be a little hard orally right now to do it. But weirdly enough, liberal democracy kind of led to the decline of religion, probably. Because it really said, religion is okay for your private life, but when it comes to the public life, we really don't need it. It's really not important. We just use science and reason to figure out how we're going to live. And you park your religion at the door when we come out here and talk together. Whether you're a Jew or a Catholic or a Muslim or a Christian or an atheist, you come together, and we just decide this. And it was part of I think, what weakened faith, because it was really saying faith is a private thing. It just makes you happy, but it really isn't all that necessary for how you live your whole life.
Faith is fundamentally a therapeutic function, and it is, but that's sort of where it was categorized. And of course, when psychology and psychological therapy can more reliably ease your distress and give you a sense of control in your life and that things are going better, that works better. Tony Soprano can see Dr. Melfi and be a better mobster. But of course, Dr. Melfi's got a crisis. Is this, am I a healer in order to empower a killer? And it's just on these fringes that things began to fray.
Whatever. But the fact is that when religion started to decline, the thing that now, I have some atheist friends who admit this, say the thing that actually held us together was not freedom of speech, freedom of association, using our reason. What held us together was like 80%.
In other words, it wasn't really the Constitution. And this is where, again, where cultural Christianity, people couldn't come together and say America is about Jesus. They sort of washed it a little bit. Again, this is part of what Doug Wilson is railing against, but I don't think he's actually thought this thing through, because this is part of his own argument, especially as a post-millennial, I think. What about progress don't you like if you're post-millennial? I thought the world, no, it's some sort of weird reform dispensationalism where we sort of hit a pause and we got to get it back on track, and it's like, yeah, the 19th century's calling and it wants its post-millennialism back. I shouldn't pick eschatological fights with Christians, but part of what made America work, and part of what made this whole world system of Christian secularity work, was people didn't have to sign up for Jesus, and they could, okay, you can bring in your Muhammad, you can bring in your Moses, you can bring in whoever you want, and as long as you sort of keep that private, but you play by these broadly Christian rules, this cultural Christianity, as long as it's reigning, if you play by these broadly Christian rules, yeah, everything will be fine.
Percent of the population went to either a Catholic or a Protestant church. They actually went. And that even though, the liberals and conservatives in Congress were arguing over taxes or unions, but they would never argue over same-sex marriage. They all thought it would be a horrible thing. In other words, everybody was and 80-90% of people were nominal Christians. And because they were nominal Christians, they had...
Or we could just flip that around and say they were all cultural Christians. They were cultural Christians. Their worldviews were close enough. They were formed by the same culture. They might not have actually gone to church, but they were formed by it. But now, of course, spiritual formation starting in the 20th century suddenly began happening by far more powerful tools than flannel graph in Sunday school.
They had a moral base, and they lived with the illusion that we're really not a Christian country, we're a secular country. But the fact is they'd never really had to deal with pluralism using liberal democratic structure. And when real pluralism came along, we found out we couldn't abide it. And so now here's the first thing that happened. The first group of people that actually moved away from liberal democracy into we're going to impose our worldview on you were the progressives. They were the first people to start doing it. Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, former, he calls it programmatic secularism rather than procedural secularism. In other words, it used to be the government was secular in the sense of being a neutral umpire, and said, okay, we want to make sure everybody has a level playing field to make your case and live your lives. But programmatic secularism goes like this. Put it this way. In the 60s and 70s, even the 50s, if somebody wrote a book saying it's okay to be gay, that would probably be not publishable because it would be banned as obscene speech, right? Today, if you try to write a book or say it's not okay to be gay, Now it's also condemned as obscene speech, except it's called hate speech. And what's happened is there was a kind of hegemony. It wasn't pluralistic. There was a kind of nominal Christian hegemony that really did run things. And when that fell apart, now we realize, well, who's going to get in charge of defining hate speech and obscene speech? And progressives said, we're going to do it. And so what they actually have done is they are imposing a kind of...
And what's interesting, so why was it progressives that did it? And I think there you really have to look at George Marsden and the history of the secularizing of the universities. Because towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, universities dropped their...
Someone's at the front door.
Someone's at the front door. At home. Universities dropped their... began to basically demote their religion department, and humanities basically came in instead of overt Christian formation. 19th century, at the end of the Civil War, you have this rise in church attendance. This is sort of peak Christian nationalism in American culture. After, just listen to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It's post-millennial. It's Christian nationalist. And everybody understood that America, this was the ethos of the West. The UK had it too. Just read, I forget his name right now, a great book on the religious nature of the First World War. Terrific book. The First World War was a very interesting religious fight. But at that point, and then especially even into the Second World War, pluralism, the West became pluralist enough, especially now with the end of colonialism, when now suddenly you have the former colonies in Africa and Asia now sending immigrants to places like the UK. They're going to have to figure out how to live together. So there's definitely a Christianizing of the other religions that are permitted in these places. But at the same time, there's also this movement. And so then it tends to be the university that says, we're not going to listen to the church. I pointed out this document, American Malvin, which was from March of 1942 in Time magazine. If you Google it, you can pull the article right up. It's a fascinating article because they're basically sketching out the mid-20th century liberal order. And you have people like Eleanor Roosevelt, who's sort of setting this up in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And so liberal Christian democracies now stand in triumph over Nazism, and they're setting up to hold the line against communism, and the way they're going to do it is with God. And so God gets recruited to hold back atheist communism. But of course, at the end of the Cold War, that's no longer the problem. The problem is religious fundamentalism. And so now suddenly, we want to talk about the Muslims, but some liberals say, well, that's racist. You can't really talk about the Muslims. So, we can talk about white evangelicals and fundamentalists. They're right here. We can pick on them all we want. And basically, especially in the university context, pay no price at all. So we're just going to pick on these people because we're looking for a religious person to pick a fight with. There's a great quote from a Civil War general. I forget which one it is. It's in Ken Burns' civil rights documentary. I just want to find a small man and lick him. And lick him doesn't mean with your tongue. I just want to find a religious man and smack him because I'm mad about what the Muslims did in New York City, and to pick on them looks racist, so let's just pick on the fundamentalists at home. And of course, you've got the militia movement, you've got the Oklahoma City bombing, so yeah, there's stuff down there that you can definitely point to, and you've of course got the latest massive, with the possible exception of the de-churching, which I'm reading now, this massive religious movement, which was the civil rights movement, which just completely remaps the mainline church. And there's a great piece that I've pointed out a number of times. So all of this is happening, and it's just dramatically changing the landscape.
Programmatic speech and obscene speech. And progressives said, we're going to do it. And so what they actually have done is they are imposing a kind of programmatic hard secularism. And conservatives and Christians have seen that. They say, you know what, you're not being neutral anymore. You're really actually pushing. You're actually saying you have to keep your religion totally private, when our religion doesn't allow that. Now, by the way, it's the same problem with Islam. So they're going to have, the more Muslims that are here, the more problems they're going to have there too.
And that's already coming up. You don't find those stories often in the paper, but I look for them. And you're going to have the same problem with Roman Catholics and evangelical Hispanics moving up from Latin America. And, you could see California swing culturally, where you're going to have Muslims and Africans and Latin Americans and some conservative whites sort of ally together. And, again, I live in Sacramento, much more connected with the African American community, not disconnected from politics that goes on here in terms of state politics. And, even the Democrats in power that have a supermajority, some of those that are smart know they got to be careful, because this whole thing could swing again. California is a state of, is a very tumultuous state.
But the issue is that conservatives are pushing back, wrongly, I think, and are saying, yeah, liberal democracy doesn't work. We need...
See, and it's exactly what Doug Wilson is saying. Liberal democracy doesn't work. And I think that's just way too binary. It's worked. It's not going to keep working. The question about how post-WASPy mainline, post that group of people, that the question how we do this in a credo nationalist country like the United States, one thing I know won't work if you just keep kicking the slats out from under the civil religion that Robert Bella pointed out in the 1960s. Yeah, well, then you're just going to really, in other words, the country's going to have, I've been talking about a confessional conversation in the Christian Reformed Church. The country's going to have a conversation about religion, and it's going to be difficult because people are going to have to come to agreements, and they're going to have to do it as they did before in some ways, sort of with religion staying implicit. I mean, the dream of some people is to make religion explicit again. Well, the kind of religion that was explicit in American history wasn't, deism was basically an old way of getting at this. And when people like George Washington, a great book on this, Faiths Plural of Our Fathers. Read the book. It's a very complex picture of Washington's faith, of Franklin's faith, of Thomas Jefferson's faith. They understood, they probably in some ways were sort of elites that said religion is good for the masses, and so we're certainly going to support it because it's in the interest of a well-ordered democracy. And of course, Franklin too, fascinated by George Whitefield, the great evangelist. So it's a very complex story, but in many ways, it was sort of that foundation that afforded America the ability to kind of work the religious thing. You see the UK, struggling with this, and you saw some of that struggle when they actually had to put together the liturgy for the coronation. So these are big issues we have to worry about, and a lot of the really simplistic answers, and I think for the most part what we see coming from many on the right and on the left, are overly simplistic. It's just a fairy tale.
There's a lot of conservatives saying we need Christian nationalism. We actually need to get, the state needs to be overtly Christian, overtly Protestant, or there needs to be, the Catholic integralists say that the Catholic Church should be the state church. And what they're saying is there's absolutely no way to get that moral consensus. We're always going to be
and of course, gone is the day that Protestants can just say, I don't have to listen to Catholics. Now, I know Catholics don't consider themselves a denomination, and many of their numbers are nominal, but they're a significant piece of the American religious political matrix. And especially since Pope John Paul II even though there's a pretty fierce civil war going on within the Catholic Church in terms of these kinds of questions, they're a very big player in this. So, yeah, there's no going back to 1870. That day is done.
Fragmented. Liberal democracy doesn't work. And it is a crisis because the fact is, as long as everybody was a nominal Christian, liberal democracy works, and it doesn't. We're not that anymore. Liberal democracy undermined Christianity and religion in general and created this situation where we truly are divided. And now the old liberal democratic proceduralism doesn't bring us together. We're just at each other's throats. We have alternate views of reality, totally different views of reality. And I don't have a good way forward. I mean, if you were asking me that question, I'm not going to answer it because I'm actually thinking it out. I still think liberal democracy is way better than Catholic
And he's no longer with us.
integralism or Protestant Christian nationalism. But I also feel like you've got to call out the progressives, to say this, what you consider democracy actually isn't. It is actually an imposition of your worldview on us. So I feel like we have to call both sides out. But when I do that, I am, maybe Carrie, I am called both sidism, playing, or being, trying to be apolitical when you can't be. I don't think that's possible. But I do think it's fair to say, sorry, right and left, I don't know what the alternative is, but what you are proposing is absolutely wrong. We'll never.
Well, and so, I mean, this is sort of where you start the negotiation and where it's not unlike the confessional conversation the Christian Reformed Church has to have, but the Christian Reformed Church is just such a smaller thing. This is going to be what the nation really wrestles with for a while. And I really don't think that the Holy Post is understanding this at all. And I think they're just sort of seeing it through a lens from not too many years ago, and that moment's gone. And I think in the Christian Reformed Church we saw that moment was gone in synods 2022 and 2023. I don't know about, I think Skye and Phil are Christian Missionary Alliance. I don't know what the deal is in their denomination, but I know, I mean, part of the issue is that the establishment is always the last to know. And for the Christian Reformed Church, the establishment is Grand Rapids. And for neo-evangelicalism, Billy Graham, Carl F. Henry, all of these people, Carroll Stream, Illinois, Wheaton College, that's the last place for them to know. And I'm sorry, it's coming for you.
Curious academic movement?
I think it absolutely could. And I think there is some overlap, actually, between what you've described in the Christian nationalism, because the reality is that a lot of the folk who are kind of recognizing the value and virtues of the Christian inheritance are also, ideologically probably more right-wing, they are more conservative, they are more anti-woke and all the rest of it. And that's perhaps to be expected because, that they are inevitably more about conserving things and about sort of...
Well, but they've also seen, and I've talked about this a lot, many of them are, Jordan Peterson sort of positioned himself as a classical liberal. And so that comes up a lot, partly because Jordan Peterson sort of stated it that way. But modernity is receding, and there's no going back to 1945 or 1985 because the world is just different. And the program, I think, of sort of the moderate evangelical that were sort of just conservative mainliners for the most part of, well, we're just going to, I think it's done. I think it's over.
Tearing things down and, changing everything. But at the same time, I think you're right that it can easily become just another kind of politicized movement. Absolutely. And the reality is, I talk...
And so, of course, again, on this channel, many of us, Jordan, why don't you talk less politics and more of this? Do more seminars, Exodus seminars. They're your best work. Talk to Peugeot, talk to Vervaeke, talk to religious figures. But at the same, everybody gets a right to do politics, and that's Jordan gets a right to do that. So,
talking in the book about the fact that there are a number of these thinkers who can see the kind of psychological and cultural benefits of Christianity, but they're treating it, as you say, like a kind of useful fiction. But of course, I don't have to subscribe to that myself. But if the hoi polloi want to believe it and it helps society to get along, then bravo.
And again, that's sort of Franklin and possibly Washington's take on it. Jefferson was a little bit of an odder duck, but and there are many like that. And I'm a preacher too, and so if they come into my church, I'm going to share basically what Tom Holland says, which is, yeah, but without sort of that base, are you really going to be able to preserve these values that you had in mid-20th century liberal democracy without that foundation that Christian churches and people practicing in Christian churches laid for it? In other words, that ability to have these generous, strong values is an achievement. And so, I understand Skye's critique, and I've made it myself in a number of different ways, but I just think that the old program is over.
And I think that, unfortunately, can be the kind of supercilious attitude that comes from that quarter. The problem for me is that they've got it the wrong way around, effectively. Christianity isn't sort of metaphorically true because it works. I think it works because it is literally true. And so to that...
And of course, he just cued Brett Weinstein in that.
extent, anyone who wants to have the benefits and fruits of Christianity, I don't think ultimately you're going to get it unless you are a Christian. And that means, obviously, everything that entails in terms of it being centered around Christ, not around some political institution or movement and so on. So I think you're absolutely right to point that out, that it's easy. These things in a purely human capacity can easily go off in directions that are not necessarily Christian in the end, and that's something we need to be very aware of.
How do you see this more ivory tower interest, this revival of interest among academics and intellectuals in Christianity? How do you imagine that trickling down to the population, to the average person inside? We saw New Atheism do that because you had these luminaries write these very popular books that ended up influencing a lot of conversations in churches and ministries. Are you beginning to see that happen in the other direction with Christianity being of interest in the ivory tower, and how is that manifesting itself?
I mean, New Atheism did a really good job of kind of doing the popular level kind of communication, and so and it's still, even though as a kind of cultural movement, it's rather passé now. You still see that all the time if you just get into a Facebook discussion with someone, or the comments on YouTube or whatever. New Atheism is in a sense alive and well in the comment section, but at the same time, this new movement, I would say, it does still, to some extent, it does exist in that slightly more academic, slightly more rarefied sort of place. I think that, having said that, the fact that we now exist in a YouTube podcast kind of world means that it's a lot easier for those messages to filter down than perhaps it used to be. And I think the birth of that stuff was also partly why the New Atheism took off in the way it did.
You don't have to ask me if this is filtering down and getting to people. It's not hard to make videos to have those people find you. You certainly found me.
I would say that in terms of books, I'd say you've got something like Jordan Peterson, his best-selling book 12 Rules for Life. What's interesting about that is that it was a huge bestseller, and it's stuffed with references to the Bible. It's full of this stuff. Now, it's not a kind of it's not an evangelical sort of text by any means, because it does have this sort of sense of it's about the psychological usefulness of Christianity and everything else. But at the same time, I've met a lot of people for whom people like Peterson and others have become a sort of gateway drug to Christianity. So even if those thought leaders, if you like, haven't made the step themselves, they've kind of opened the door. They've made it intellectually feasible for other people to walk through it, because they've just been given the permission to take this seriously. And when they have, they've found that actually it seems to make sense to them. They're able to walk through that door. And I think there is that.
Maybe I should send Skye about 400 Randos videos to answer his question.
Trickle down effect, because these are people with huge platforms, you know, reaching millions of people through podcasts and YouTube or events or whatever it might be. And while it's obviously all mixed up as well with quite a lot of the politicization that swirls around in those kinds of discussions, I do see people who have come out of it, you know, saying, actually, I am kind of a convert from this phenomenon. I've actually, now whether that will become a sort of significant, you know, movement of people remains to be seen. But I have seen at least some evidence that it is actually reaching people on the ground in that way.
Yeah, I'm very curious to watch this unfold, because I am having conversations with people who are generally secular in their outlook, who are coming to recognize the bankruptcy of that worldview and some of the abuses that are happening on the extreme kind of more fundamentalist left, what people might call the ultra woke left. And they are intrigued by the Jordan Petersons and some of these other figures that are either Christian curious or pro-religion. My question is, does that curiosity ultimately lead people to faith in Christ, or does it lead them simply to the alt-right? And
there's your either or right there. Now, first of all, this alt-right thing has been thrown around a lot, and I really haven't heard a lot of the use of the word since like 2018, 2019. So I'm not quite sure what he means by the alt-right, but, you know, is Skye sort of just the opposite of Doug Wilson? Is he playing the same game? Either your politics is your religion or it isn't. And it's just interesting how he put those terms right next to each other. And I thought, wow, that really got my attention.
An embrace of cultural religion as a way of giving the middle finger to the secularists on the far left. And if that's the big question, is which way does it go? And
I don't know that people need to find Christianity to be able to give the finger to someone they don't like. It seems to me that Christians, for the most part, have a little bit more reticence about giving the finger than others. That was really part of the point of this article in The Atlantic by Daniel K. Williamson. He might have been the one that had written that other piece. I'm going to have to look that up. When basically he said churches actually have a way of moderating people's political animus, let's say, which I've been thinking about this today, reading this De-Churched book, because what I find is that we've been fed a narrative in the mass media for a long time that sets up these stereotypes. Now, as with almost all stereotypes, where there's smoke, there's fire, and you can find examples of the stereotype. But the stereotype is such that, well, Christians are mostly conservative who go to churches that tell them to do all kinds of things, and people are in lockstep. And this article written here, which basically says, you know, the truth is that churches tend to moderate people's political extremism, and the more people leave churches, the more the politics becomes their religion. But without a church community, in many cases, the nation's political system becomes their church, and the results are polarizing. They bring whatever moral and social values they acquire from their church experience, and they apply those values in a political sphere with an evangelical zeal. For many of those leaving church traditions, that place a strong emphasis on concern for the poor and marginalized. The values they retain from church translates into socially liberal political positions. Davis and Graham found that, this is the book that I'm reading right now, found that the de-churched Christians who came from liberal mainline Protestants and Catholic traditions likely become politically progressives. And, you know, the same is true of the other side. So church is the salt of the earth, but it's not here to keep either party in power.
It's going to be different for different people. Before we wrap up here, I'd love you to share a little bit about your experience with Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man actor, the historian and author of Dominion.
So, so Tom Holland is less of a, well, people who listen to The Rest is History are going to become alt-right. No, they're just going to become better educated. But Tom Holland has his own political views. Tom Holland has his own things too. And Tom is just a little less prickly than Jordan on many things. Although once Tom gets going, Tom can get going. So anyway, I just thought, I just did this video about Doug Wilson, and it's probably should do one on the Holy Post. And again, I listen to the Holy Post regularly. Phil Visser's book, Me, Myself, and Bob, it's a great book. It's a great book. I really enjoy listening to Phil Visser, and I like a lot of what Skye Jethani does. Again, I made a video about Doug Wilson. And so right away, some people are going to be like, oh, PVK must be heading alt-right. And then they listen to the video and like, oh, it was kind of critical of Doug Wilson, so PVK is okay. And now I'm doing a video about Holy Post. And, people are complex. They have different perspectives. They have different views. Take them one at a time and take their positions one at a time. You don't have to demonize them or marginalize them or think in this low resolution, good, bad thing all the time. I'll tell you, I dare bet if I did a road trip with Phil Visser and Doug Wilson, we would have a hoot. Those two guys, I think, are probably be about as fun to hang out with as you could imagine. And so yeah, if Doug Wilson and Phil Visser want to go on a road trip with me and do a tour, I'll do it if I can find the time. Because I think both guys would be great. And, Skye Jethani too seems like a wonderful guy. I could have a wonderful conversation with him. But why this little corner for me? What is this all about? Part of the reason I think I found Unbelievable very early and I really loved it was because why can't we have conversations with each other? That's exactly what we need. And we have to treat people carefully, but we can go after spirits and ideas. And that's what we should do. So the point isn't that, PVK did a takedown video of Skye Jethani. That is not the point at all. The point is we need to talk about these things because the truth be told, part of what made this last 70 years, there's a lot of other things too, but part of what made the world in many ways a lot better since the end of the Second World War is because of, I'm going to call it Christian secularism. And it's going away. And how will the world be without it? Now, I think a lot of Christian DNA got into a lot of the other world religions during this American colonial period. I don't mean that when America was a colony, but I mean during the second half of the 20th century, during the Cold War, when we were sort of colonizing all the rest of the world sort of to fight the Cold War. So, colonialism's always a bad thing. No, it isn't. Was it a bad thing that the British ended the slave trade? Was it a bad thing that the British stopped the cremation of Indian widows when their husbands died? Were those bad things? No, they weren't. You've got to sort these things through. Was it Nigel Biggs? Is that the guy that wrote that book on that? Did some podcasts, the conversation with Peterson. So, we need to have better conversations. We need to sift through these things. I think actually the Doug Wilsons and the Skye Jethani's of the world are a blessing to us because they force us to have the conversation. So if you're Team Doug Wilson or Team Skye Jethani, or if you're alt Doug Wilson or alt Skye Jethani, I don't care. We'll have the conversations. Let's talk about the ideas because these ideas are important. And actually, when we have some of these conflicts, this is how we sift through these super complex ideas and we try things out. And hopefully along the way, we make the world a little bit better. And we serve God, and we serve the future. So, yeah, I got a little ranty there. I know some of you like it when I get ranty, and some of you don't. And it all depends on what I get ranty about. So there it was. Leave a comment. I'll read it.